So today we have Matt Friedman, who is the CEO of the Mekong Club. And I met Matt a little over a year ago, and I was fortunate enough to be able to see him present to a nonprofit organization. And I was moved, I was amazed, and I was a little bit frightened because some of the things he was saying, I really had no idea that this was taking place in the year 2017. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to have dinner with Matt and his lovely wife, Sylvia, and I got to hear more of his story about his work at USAID and the UN and what led him to devote his life to fight against modern slavery. So he's a very special man, and I'm very excited to have him here. Before I welcome Matt to the stage, I'd like to show a brief video, just maybe set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. Thank you. And with that, please welcome Matt Friedman.
Oh, I'm way ahead of myself here. Okay, thank you for this opportunity to be here today. My name is Matt Friedman. I've been a kind of modern-day abolitionist for about 30 years now. And as Marie said, I started off with USAID and the United Nations. What we're going to be talking about today is modern slavery. I'll also be talking about human trafficking. And then I'm going to try to relate my talk to why is it that all of a sudden in this room a lot of people are talking about this topic. This used to be a topic that the public sector focused on. Why in the private sector is all of a sudden this kind of an important issue? I'm also going to be talking a little bit about superheroes at the end. That's all I'm going to say about that. I'll come back to that particular issue. Okay, so let's start here. When most people think about human trafficking, this is what they think about: forced prostitution. For good reason. There are 4.5 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. Now, my first exposure to this was 27 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was basically to take U.S. government money and translate it into healthier people. I was given the HIV/AIDS portfolio. My job was basically to help people in Nepal with this disease. But what we were finding is that in Nepal, girls 12, 13, 14 years old were HIV positive. For any of you who have ever been to Nepal, it's a very conservative culture. We shouldn't have found that disease among that particular population. So we started to go and talk to them to hear their story about how this happened. And the story went something like this. A human trafficker, usually a guy 24, 25 years old, would go into the community and show a bunch of money. He wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then go and tell people, I'm looking for a wife. I don't want an urban wife. They're way too difficult. I want a rural wife. He would go until he found a girl, 12, 13 years old. He would befriend her and then go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. The family's thinking, wow, He's rich, he's handsome, he has this money, life is going to be good. So they agree. 2 days later, they actually go through the wedding ceremony. The entire community is there. Everyone's saying, wow, how lucky is she? Everyone in that family is going to be taken care of. He then goes and says after the marriage, okay, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what is going to happen. Instead of going to Kathmandu, he takes her to Mumbai, India. Now, this girl's never been more than 20 miles away from her home. When she's in Nepal, India, she thinks she's still in Nepal. So he takes her to the brothel area, he puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here, I'll be back in a few minutes. As she was coming in, she's beginning to see all these people dressed funny, all these men, all these women. She says, no, don't leave me. He says, it's okay, just stay here. He then goes off to the madam to get the $600 for having sold her to the brothel. He has all the gold that comes from the marriage, and he hands the wedding pictures over to the madam. He then goes to Nepal to do this again and again and again, maybe 60, 70 times in a year. The madam then goes into the room and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 10 men a day every day because I say so. Her initial reaction is shock. No, my husband loves me. He wouldn't do that. Yes, that's what happens. When she comes to internalize that this is her lot in life, many of them say, I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then takes out the photographs from the wedding and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation where she can't get out. To make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You simply shame her. So they bring in 4 or 5 professional rapists. They bring her to a place. They rape her 30 times in a 2-day period until eventually she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's on the line. She'll be with 10 guys a day, every single day, for about 2 years until she gets what's called black eye. That's where she's so spiritually and emotionally and physically worn out, nobody wants her anymore. If she's lucky, she gets back to Nepal. Many didn't. So I was hearing this story over and over again. But it wasn't until I actually went to those brothels that I understood the sheer evil of this situation. I was invited by the Indian government to go there to have public health checks. I had a police officer with me. I went from brothel to brothel. I went into one of the brothels and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy walk in, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me and said, save me, they're doing terrible things to me. I turned to the police officer and I said, okay, well, let's get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. I still have this child hanging on to me, wearing a dress 10 sizes too big, hysterically crying. I said, why can't we do this? He says, because they'll kill us before they'll let us leave. So to make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police. But as you can imagine, she was gone. Now, I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. I did everything I could to avoid that lifestyle, to avoid everything. So I wanted to make money, live the good life. But life kept conspiring against me. And I realized that this was a big test. This was my test. I was supposed to help that little girl. And I didn't. And then I suffered afterwards. I just had nightmares. I couldn't sleep. And I eventually did what a lot of us who stand on these types of stage do, just surrendered to the fact that, okay, I can't turn my back on this. This is what I'm going to do with my life. And that was 27 years ago. But it's not just women and girls. It's men and boys. This is a fishing trawler. There's a certain number of you in this room who deal with seafood. Now, the story behind this is a Cambodian boy, 14, 15 years old, hears that there's work in Thailand. He crosses over the border. He has to support his family. He's looking around for work, can't find it. Finally, a trafficker, somebody in the neighborhood, comes up to him and says, hey, brother, I'm from Cambodia. You're from Cambodia. It looks like you need some help. Let me give you some money. Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat will go out. You'll catch fish. You're a guy. Guys love fishing, right? Okay, after 3 months, the boat will come back. You'll have pocketfuls of money. Life is going to be good. But that isn't what is going to happen. He gets down to the boat. He has no idea he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, and it stays out for 4 years. During that time, he'll work 18, 19 hours a day, every single day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, tortured. He doesn't get food. They give him rice and fish to eat. No fruits, no vegetables, nothing nutritious for that 4-year duration time. To get him to work that hard, they give him strong stimulants. So his body is constantly under the influence of these drugs. If he gets injured or sick, they don't bring the boat in. They just throw him overboard. There's a lot of murder associated with this. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in. He says, give me some money. Captain says, go away. You're illegally in our country. He says, I'll go to the police and tell them what you did. Captain says, go ahead. We own the police. This is another example of human trafficking. There's another Thailand example. This is a seafood packing site in a place called Sumut Sakhon in Thailand. The story behind this is in Sumut Sakhon there's about 4,500 seafood packing companies. There's some good ones. There's some not so good ones. This happened to be a bad one. So a person from Myanmar hears that there's this factory, goes and knocks on the door. Manager comes out and says, well, what do you want? Looking for a job. Manager says, okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent of $50 US a month, but you have to stay in the factory. This guy's thrilled. He's never made more than $25 US. He immediately accepts the job, goes into the factory, begins working 17 hours, 18 hours a day. He does it for about 2 months, terrible conditions, but at least he knows he'll be able to send that money home. After about 2 months, he goes to the manager and says, I'd like to be paid. Manager says, well, I forgot to mention one thing. It costs $54 for you to be here. I'm only paying you $50, so guess what? You owe me money. So before we did the raid and rescue for this particular factory, some of these people had been there 3 or 4 years, languishing in a situation where every single day they worked, they got deeper into debt. The other thing about this is once a month they would take one of these people to the back, beat them until they were bloody, take a photograph of it, and say, if you try to leave, this is what will happen to you. Another example of human trafficking. But it's not just adults. We see a lot of children associated with this. You can see kind of a brickyard in Bangladesh, a mine in Pakistan. You can see a shoemaking factory in Vietnam, fireworks. But when I lived in Bangladesh, I was there for 5 years. What I dealt with were 2-year-olds being sent to the Middle East. Now, those of you who are parents, you know that a 2-year-old doesn't have the manual dexterity or the concentration to be able to do regular work. What do you do with a 2-year-old? You put them on the back of a camel. Why? Because if you put an infant on the back of the camel, they kick and scream, camel runs. And they race camels by having infants on the back. Why use a 2-year-old? They're light. They don't weigh anything. They don't slow the camel down. By the time the child is 5 years old, he's starting to gain some weight. He's starting to get to a point where, he's slowing the camel down, so they take this little boy and throw him out on the street. So at a time when most 5-year-olds are starting kindergarten, beginning school, beginning their life, you have a 5-year-old little boy by himself on the street, fending for himself. You can imagine what kind of life this individual would have. Okay, so as was indicated, I work for the United Nations. And when you work for the United Nations, you have a definition for everything. This is the definition for human trafficking. It's called the Palermo Protocol. And it has 2 parts. The first part is for adults. So if you have an act, one of these, by means of one of these, for the purpose of exploitation, you have trafficking. So if you recruit a person with fraud for the purpose of exploitation, you have trafficking. If you harbor somebody with threats for the purpose of exploitation, you have trafficking. Seems pretty simple. It's very straightforward, isn't it? For children, you don't need that second category. If you have one of these for the purpose of exploitation, you have trafficking. Now, during the time I worked for the United Nations, I supported this definition. I had to. It was my job. But if you would ask me, I would take this definition and throw it right out the window. Why? Because it places all of this emphasis on the movement of a person from one place to another into something bad without putting the emphasis on the bad thing. Trafficking, by definition, is the movement of something. Drug trafficking, arms trafficking, human trafficking. It places the emphasis on the movement. And so people get it mixed up with smuggling and migration. Irrespective of how you get into it, it's the end point that's the problem. Okay, so if you accept that logic, then the question is, well, what do we call this then? What do we call this thing that we've been calling human trafficking? And what we're beginning to see is that the new name that they have for it is this, modern slavery. Why? Because if a person doesn't get paid, If a person can't leave the situation, if there's physical and sexual violence, threats against the family or the self, debt bondage, their documents are taken, what else do we call it? That's the word we use. Now, we use modern because slavery today is different from 150 years ago. But there are enough commonalities that we have to accept the fact that the word does fit. Okay, so, I stand on a lot of stages and I have audiences like this, and there's a certain percentage of people that say, come on, Matt, we probably have a few slaves in the world, but we don't have that many, right? Well, according to the Slavery Index, this is the number of slaves that we have in the world, 45.8 million. There are more slaves than there are Canadians. If you were to take the smallest 130 countries and add up their populations, it still wouldn't add up to 45 million. We're talking about a huge number of people. When it comes to the United States, some estimates are 70,000. I've seen estimates of 90,000. I've seen estimates that go between 500,000 and 1 million. United States? Well, that 14-year-old girl who gets into a fight with the parents and runs away and eventually gets befriended by a pimp and forced into prostitution, by virtue of her age, if you're under the age of 18, you're automatically a trafficking victim. That counts, and there's a lot of girls in that situation. The people who pick our tomatoes and our oranges, there's a certain percentage that do it legally. There's a lot of people that don't. They're in debt bondage situation. We see it in construction sites, domestic work, sweatshops. So even here in the United States, we have human trafficking or modern slavery. When we look at the rate of exploitation, this is the number of people that enter into slavery, on an annual basis. It's estimated that there are 9.2 million people coming in. In a day, approximately 25,200. In an hour, about 1,000, or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if I count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, another slave. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the drum beats on and on and on. How many of you are surprised by these numbers? How many of you have seen these numbers before? Okay, so this is a compliance community. We haven't done a good enough job educating you guys on what you need to know. So counter-trafficking community has to take a little bit of responsibility for not doing our job. Okay, so if we break it down, about a quarter of the cases are children, the rest are adults. Once again, most people think that forced prostitution is what human trafficking is. 76% of modern slavery is actually forced labor, and as it begins to relate to you, 60% of that is associated with supply chains. That is where, all of a sudden, the public sector was basically saying, well, wait a minute, we don't know anything about supply chains, we got to go to the private sector. And that's where the transition began to come. So the telephones, the clothes, the shoes, the food that we have, somewhere in the supply chain is the possibility of slavery being associated with it. We as consumers have all supported slavery, not knowing when we did it, but it's there. And it's associated with a certain percentage of the products that we have in our lives. Okay, so let's talk about modern slavery. I'm going to offer you a job. Okay, you stand up. Okay. I'm going to give you $1 million a year. You only have to work 4 days a week. I'll give you 2 hours off for lunch. I'll give you a house, a car, 3 months of vacation, and you can live anywhere in the world you want. Are you interested? Okay. Anyone else interested? Okay, wow. I'd take that job. Thank you very much. In a millisecond. Okay, so how many of you were thinking, sounds too good to be true? Well, actually it is. If you had taken it, I would have trafficked you. Okay, so imagine if you were a person and you never made more than $1 a day, which is much of the world. And then all of a sudden somebody comes to you and says, I'm going to give you $2. And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 15 hours. And guess what? I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday. So that person's standing there thinking, sounds too good to be true. But what if it isn't? What if it's the one time in my life where I get a break? What if I finally have that chance to have a little prosperity? $2 a day, twice my income? So they have to say yes. This is how most people get into human trafficking, through deception and lies. Traffickers are the phenomenal liars. When it comes to debt, let's assume that you were living in Hong Kong and you had a family member that was really sick, and you needed 1,000 Hong Kong dollars, which is about 100-something dollars US, and I gave you that money. You had the operation. 2 days later, you try to give me 1,500 back. You're very grateful for this opportunity, with interest. 1,500, 15,000. Now you look at me and say, well, that's not fair. I'm a criminal. I don't have to be fair. We didn't talk about what the arrangements are. You either give me 15,000, something bad is going to happen to you or a family member. You need to do that. That's how traffickers basically hook people. Now, kidnapping. How many of you saw the movie Taken? Okay, so, the traffickers go into the 5-star hotel and grab the girl from under the bed, and she's kicking and screaming, and that doesn't really happen very often. Why? Because it's dangerous. Traffickers are going to get caught in that situation. It's so much easier to deceive a person into thinking they will just come along with you. That's really what we're talking about here. So that's the essence of human trafficking. When it comes to the organizations that are supposed to address this, it's supposed to be the governments, but governments don't really like this topic. It's embarrassing in China and Thailand and Myanmar to admit that you have slavery, even in the United States. So they do things, but it's really not all that much. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system. But I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels eating some of the best food you could possibly imagine, talking about poverty. There's a real disconnect between what we were doing and where the real people were. So it's the NGOs that are doing the lion's share of the work. They're doing the heavy lifting on this. But actually, when you stop and look at the statistics again, if out of the 45.8 million, 75% are in forced labor and 60% of them are in supply chains, who else needs to be associated with this? Private sector. But if the governments don't like this, private sector hates this issue. Because they're often on the receiving end of somebody pointing the finger and saying it's all your fault. Because of your greed, because of your desire to make money, you will use slavery. Now, obviously, that's ridiculous, but a lot of people believe that, and so a lot of consumers are beginning to put pressure on the private sector. Okay, so I talked about what the issue is, talked about a little bit about what's being done to address it. Now let me show you the report card for the number of people that were helped out of slavery last year and the number of criminals that went to jail. So out of 45.8 million, what would be a good percentage of people to be helped? Think about that in your mind. Out of 500,000 criminals, what would be a good number of criminals to go to jail? You guys have it in your mind? Well, here it is. Last year, we helped 78,000 people out of 45.8 million. That's 0.2% of the victims. Out of 500,000 criminals, we put about 4,000 in jail. That's 0.8%. These numbers are right. This is what we have. This is the reality of our situation. Okay, so why is this? Well, first thing is the profits generated from slavery are excessive, $150 billion a year. Second largest transnational crime, second only to drug trafficking. The amount of money that's used to address it is about $350 million annually, or 0.23% of that. In the United States, we eat $6 billion worth of potato chips. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the amount of money that we have globally to address human slavery. Can you see what the problem is here? We're outgunned. When it comes to kind of the issue, there's about 10,000 do-gooders like me around the world in NGOs, working for governments and so forth. Compare that to 500,000 incentivized, greedy criminals, tax-free money. You can see, again, what we're up against. Another thing is that this is hidden. People don't want you to know that it's there. I can go to just about any city, and within 5 miles, I can find slavery. You can find it here in Washington, D.C. as well, because we know what to look for. But if you're not trained on how to find this, you're not going to be able to find it. And that's what compliance people all over the world are struggling with. We hear that it's there, we hear these numbers, but where is it? I'll come back to that point a little bit. Lastly is awareness. Once again, how many of you in this room knew 25% of what I was talking about before I did this talk today? Okay, so I see more hands than I usually do, but I would expect that. This is an audience that is now being introduced in this particular way. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care about it. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything to address it. And so that's why awareness becomes so important. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to kind of a more direct relationship between why are we talking about this in the private sector. And to begin with, I have to go back to prostitution. So when HIV/AIDS hit, public health people like us were going into the brothels asking questions. And after we did our condom distribution thing, we would say, well, what's your story? And we were hearing these horrific descriptions about how these girls were tricked and deceived to prostitution. Prior to that, nobody ever talked to women in prostitution. They were bad girls. They were criminals. Nobody paid any attention to them. We had no idea that this was a human rights violation. And it took us a long time to convince people. But much of the foundation of the counter-trafficking movement has been on this because of the moral repugnance of a 15-year-old girl. I had a girl come to me not too long ago, and she said, I'm 15 years old, and I've been raped 7,000 times. Why? 10 times a day for 2 years? That's 7,000 times. She couldn't understand why the world didn't care. Because of that feeling that we get, it becomes very important. But around 2005, we started to say, well, wait a minute, the definition includes more than just forced prostitution. We started looking at the fishing industries, we started looking at agriculture, sweatshops, and as we got deeper into this, then we started to ask the question, well, what happens in these private sector locations? And the people were saying, well, supply chains. Now, 10 years ago, you asked me what a supply chain is, I'd say, I don't know, I never heard of it. Do you know anything about it? As we came to realize that we had to talk about supply chain, that's when we started to enlist the private sector to be a part of this discussion. And then because of the $150 billion generated from this, that's illegal money. If even $1 of that makes it into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. Who gets penalized? The banks. That's why the banks have been brought into this. They have to protect their business because with this amount of money, you know that a certain amount of it's making into a commercial bank. Okay, so much of the emphasis in the initial part of our discussion focused on a business risk. If you don't do something, you are going to have your company in a terrible situation. So you have to do something. Now, some of the trends that we're seeing related to this, I'll start with legislation. Back 7 or 8 years ago, the only legislation we had is what we would call kind of non-binding soft legislation. The United Nations and the business world would come together, talk about human rights. They'd come up with a report. Everybody would pat each other on the back. They'd hand it out. But it didn't matter if you used it or not. There was no binding element to it. The first kind of act that had a little bit of emphasis was the California Transparency Act, 2012. Basically says if you're a company of $100 million in retail or manufacturing, if you have one product in California, you have to basically say on your website what you're doing to address the issue. If you're not doing anything, you're in compliance. Then came the UK Modern Slavery Act that said, okay, we're going to do even more than this. We're going to have the same basic foundation. You have to say what you're doing on your website, but we're going to add 2 more components to it. Annual report, plus your directors have to sign it. So in the past, it was at the legal level, it was at the compliance level, now all of a sudden directors involved. What we're seeing is that in the EU, there's more emphasis on the fact that eventually there will be penalties and fines. That's the direction we're seeing. And so what we're seeing then is it was initially just website posting, annual reports, and then eventually what we will see is an emphasis on fines and penalties, similar to what we see with the corruption legislation that's around the world. Second is lawsuits. Costco was sued because they buy shellfish from Thailand. Mars and Nestle's, no, it's not a mistake. They make cat food. And so they were buying shellfish from Thailand as well. And then the chocolate industry was also sued. The idea is that, well, if these organizations are going into areas where there's slavery, then they have to be punished. Okay? And in reality, these lawsuits kind of, in many ways, are very unfair because they're forcing organizations and companies that don't necessarily have direct relationships with these supply chains to do things. And for the most part, many of these lawsuits haven't moved. And let me just at this point say that as I'm going through this business risk side of thing, I want you to know my bias. My organization works with corporations. We support them. We never name and shame. We do it in a way that helps them. But this is the reality of the situation that we're finding that many businesses are working in. Lastly, thirdly, increased attention related to media. So if you look at major articles and exposés related to human trafficking, it's almost doubled every single year. And if you look at 2017, you'll see that it's already up to about 120. How many of you are seeing this change? So much more information on this. It's out there. It's just, and so what we're seeing is that, like, the environmental movement seems to be going down, and the new issue of our time is modern slavery. So if that is the case, if that turns out to be the direction, then expect that this will be a major emphasis for the next 5 or 10 years, because that's the way these issues basically move forward. We're seeing a new wave of activism. These are various organizations that work on the issue. IJM, an organization that, when I first knew them, they had a budget of around 1.2 million. Now they're up to 49 million. Free the Slaves, they had a budget around 600,000. They're up to about 7 million. A21 up to something like 9 million. Walk Free had a war chest of 750 million US dollars. And they were an organization that were very aggressively kind of working to address getting businesses to do things through pressure. And the way some of these organizations work is they pick a particular topic, in this particular case, palm oil, and they have a list of 9 million people, and what they do is they send an email to all these people saying, send an email to this company or a letter saying that you are dissatisfied because this company's working with palm oil, it has association with slave labor, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine if you were a compliance officer and you come in on a Monday morning, you got 9 million emails in your inbox. Not a good day for that particular individual. Okay, lastly, we have what I would describe as comparative analysis documentation, where what they do is they get a report and they have indicators of exploitation, and then they take the brands and they list them on the bottom. And the issue that I have with this is the information is collected through surveys. If you don't fill out the survey, you get an F. Okay, and even if you fill it out, they interpret whether or not you get green or yellow or red in the various boxes here. There's no way of comparing companies this way. Your data is different, your approaches are different, but once you put it into a glossy document similar to this, people assume that it's real. And I don't know how many times I've had people come and say, well, I'm not going to go to that particular store. I saw it in the naughty and nice list, and they're listed as naughty, and as a result of that, I'm not going to do it. But if an NGO puts this out, nobody's going to go against them, even if it's wrong, simply because it looks like the big corporation going after the little NGO. But a lot of this data just is not real, and it's inaccurate. So many people have a negative perspective of the private sector, and this needs to change. So let's talk a little bit about manufacturing, just as an example. So I work with a lot of manufacturers, and let's use a typical 3-tier supply chain. Top tier, you're actually assembling, say, the running shoe. Second tier is where you get the shoelaces and the zippers and the sole of the shoe. And then tier 3 is the raw material. You're talking about literally hundreds, if not thousands, of possible audit points. But for the most part, when you talk to the manufacturing world, they have been auditing tier 1 for a long time, but very few of them have been going down to tier 2 or 3. The expectation with the legislation is you're supposed to know your entire supply chain. Most organizations don't. And so what we're seeing as a vulnerability is that supply chain auditing is not refined enough to go to the second and third tier, although it's beginning to move in that direction. The expectation is it goes all the way down. There's kind of a negative distrust of the private sector that we see, and there's a lot of emphasis on naming and shaming. Why? Because the NGO world doesn't know anything about business. I can say this because I come from that world. And so because we don't know how to address business, we use the one thing in our toolbox, naming and shaming. We can force a company to do something simply by going after them. I personally feel that in many ways we lose so much from that particular process, but nevertheless, this is the world that we live in. Okay, so in Thailand and within Asia, I'll just talk a little bit about some of the risks that we see on a regular basis. The first are recruitment fees. So, when you and I go for a job, there's a job in the newspaper, we apply for it, we don't have to pay anything for that. We either get the job or not. But in a lot of less developed countries, you have to pay for the privilege of having a job. And so you may pay the equivalent of 21 months or 19 months, or these are averages for these countries, in order to have the privilege to go overseas into a job. Now, during the time that you're paying this back, you're borrowing money, So you have a lot of migrants who are in situations where basically they've entered into a world where they will never get out of debt because the debt and the compounding interest and so forth is such that, it just prevents them from ever getting out of a poverty situation. I lived and worked in Nepal for 8 years, and what we would see in Nepal is that a migrant would get a contract that had 7 pages in Nepalese, the 8th page was in Hindi, and then it would go back to Nepalese. The 7 pages said all the right things, all the things that a person wanted to read, but that kind of 8th page basically said everything above this is null and void. This is really what it is. Person signs it, they're told don't worry about it, it's just boilerplate, and then they get trapped in a situation. Because they're poor, they don't know that there's remedies around this, and even if there were people they could go to, they don't have the money to pay to get out of this situation, so they believe that these contracts are real. Passport withholding. Now, I had a friend recently lose his passport. He was able to get another one in 2 months. Some people, it takes them 6 years to get a passport, and if they lose it, they'll never get another one. You understand this leverage, why it's so important to have this. So if an employer takes the passport, you can understand why it is that this individual would want to get it back so bad. Kind of limited freedom of movement. That factory that I showed you at the beginning had 9-foot walls, it had barbed wire, it had security guards. A lot of people simply can't get out. And if they do get out, even when they run off to the police station, oftentimes because of corruption or protection and so forth, they don't get any kind of support. Non-payment. The thing behind this is you often have a situation where kind of a person is told to get paid in 3 months. They wait for 3 months, then they say, oh, well, another 2 months, another 2 months, another 2 months. They're never going to get paid. But eventually when the pressure gets so much, they go to the employer, they shout and they scream. The employer makes a call to the immigration police who are in on this. They come pick the guy up. They bring him to the border, and he loses everything. That's another example. And lastly, inability to resign contracts. If you don't stick it out for the 4-year period of time, you have to pay everything back that was given to you. Fraudulent, not real, illegal, but nevertheless, if you're an ignorant migrant, doesn't have any kind of access to appropriate information, you believe this. Okay, so what we're seeing then is audits, we know that there are limitations associated with it. Like if the auditor goes and tries to talk to the employees, the manager's standing there, they don't want to talk about it, that's a limitation. So we're seeing auditors in companies kind of expanding to what I would describe as auditing plus plus. They're going to all different levels, lower than they have been in the past. They're looking to see if recruitment and labor standards are in place, whether or not there may be debt that's creating an issue. We're seeing traceability. There's a lot of organizations that I saw working on traceability, some really good ones. We're seeing anonymous kind of hotlines where basically you have one NGO that would allow for employees to call in and talk about what's happening. You have kind of what I would describe as kind of forensic accounting type of approaches. And in some companies, they have emergency response teams. Now, the difficulty with that last category is, and I'll use this as an example. For years, I did kind of animal trafficking. When a bunch of turtles are in a box and you find them on an airplane, you take them off the airplane, you bring them to the woods, you let them go, no problem. When human beings are involved, it's very complicated. Do you terminate the contract? Do you try to help? If so, how do you help? What extent do you go? So most companies really don't know what to do if they find forced labor. And I know a lot of companies that come to us and say, okay, well, can you give us some suggestions and so forth? We're working with them on that, but this is kind of a gray area for most organizations. Okay, so the organization I work with is called the Mekong Club. What's that? Mekong Club. Why would you have a club that focuses on something like this? Well, the organizations that came together to develop the Mekong Club felt like the NGO world didn't understand the private sector enough to be able to address this. Shouldn't the private sector come together and address this? So organizations like Edelman and Ernst & Young and Pitney Bowes and Western Union, a whole variety of different individuals who were in Hong Kong came together and formed this organization called the Mekong Club. And basically what we do is we have an association of paid members in 4 different categories: finance and banking, footwear and apparel, hospitality and retail. 4 times a year, these people come together, and then they sit down and they say, as a community, what can we do? What do we think are the gaps? What do we as private sector individuals feel like could be done to help address this issue? So in the banking world, basically we're developing a 3-hour training, goes all the way down to the lowest level to identify red flags. When it comes to footwear and apparel, we're developing a risk assessment matrix, taking as much data as we can get to identify where in the world products and materials are where there's risk, taking whatever data we can get from auditing, from news reports and so forth to just identify where risk is. Doesn't mean that you don't work there. It just helps you to identify where you have to do more due diligence if you find things. Retail, we're doing e-learning programs. What we heard from the community is that from our 3 modules, you can't have a 30-minute training program. You need little bite-sized 3-minute things. Because nowadays, many of us, we do things in 3 minutes. So 3 minutes on definition, 3 minutes on statistics. And basically, these info action things get all the information you need in small areas. And so this is the approach that we're using. Okay, I'm almost done. So go back to my Nepal days. Years ago, when I was living in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to address this issue. So I decided I was going to write a book. So as part of this book project, I just decided I would go from shelter to interview the women and the girls. I went to one shelter, and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached Geeta, she said, no, I don't want to talk to you. But she sat and listened to all the interviews that were taking place. So I was about to leave that shelter. Finally, Geeta comes running up and says, okay, you can have my story. I said, wow, great. So Geeta sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. In over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and betrayal and murder and disease. Everything I had heard times 10. Honestly, didn't know what to say. Finally, I turned to Geeta, not knowing what to say, and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at those traffickers for what they did to you. She paused and said, no, I'm angry at you and you and you. She pointed at us. She said, where were you? She said that every single day she woke up and prayed for somebody to come and help her. Nobody came. She said she went to school till she was 12 years old, and during that time, she knew that everything around her was illegal. It was right out of the open. Why is nobody doing anything? She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for not caring enough to come and help her out. She said that every single day, 45.8 million people wake up in slavery and say, where is everybody? What's the answer? Now, I tell that story because what Geeta did is pretty much called us all out. 10,000 people like me, it's never going to be enough. We're going to stay at 0.2%. Maybe we'll get up to 0.5%. We need everybody. We need everybody to be involved. We need the corporations. We need the governments. We need the schools. We need the faith-based groups. We need the general public. We need an abolitionist movement. Short of that, we're going to stay at less than 1%. Now, a lot of people say, well, what can we possibly do? Well, I basically say, don't quit your job and go off to Cambodia and work in a shelter. But if you just did one thing a year, imagine if 10 million people did 10 million small, compassionate gestures. That would add up to something. First thing is to be proactive. The fact that you decided to come to this, that's one thing. I'll give you a point for that. You're learning, okay? And if you share this information, I'll give you 2 more points. That's 3 points right there. Okay? Organizations, the corporate sector are leader champions. You know how to solve problems. You know how to lead. Imagine if the profit from your organization was a reduction in slavery, not money. We'd be up to 20% if the world took this on in 2 years. Because that's what you guys do. And you do it so well. We in the NGO world don't have the money to be able to hire the talent that's even in this room. We just don't. But if a small percentage of that through pro bono support or support within your organization is used, imagine what the world would be like. Innovate. There's a lot of, I saw Microsoft out here. Microsoft's been very active in helping to address this. Reuters has been very involved. It's a whole bunch of different companies, I can go on, that are looking at finding creative ways of addressing the issue. Volunteering. My youngest volunteer is 9 years old. This girl saw a film on human trafficking, tracked me down on the internet, and said, I'm 9 years old and I want to help out. And I said, well, you're 9 years old. She reminded me of that show, Master Chef for Kids. You guys seen that show? little 9-year-olds cooking up a storm and everything. She said that 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Okay, so I gave her an opportunity. I said, okay, you can do this for me. She started doing internet searches. She was one of the best volunteers I had. I had second-year law students from Harvard that weren't as good as she is. Okay, so you have a situation where you have a person who has a desire to get involved, a person who wants to step up, to do these types of things. We need that. And lastly, giving. You know, the corporate world doesn't feel comfortable giving to this issue because they feel like if they do, somebody might point and say, well, you're giving to that because there's some concern there? Well, you know, there's a lot of money that goes to library books and education and cancer for good reason. But this particular issue needs help as well. We're at 0.2% of the people getting this. So what we need is superheroes. A superhero is an individual who doesn't wear a cape and fly from building to building. They're an individual who does something because it's the right thing, not expecting to get anything back, because it makes them feel like they're contributing to something. So that's my definition of superheroes. Do I have any superheroes in here? Come on, guys. Raise your hands. Everyone in here is a superhero. You just haven't figured it out yet. Nobody's helped you to apply that to something. Now, I happen to be the anti-slavery guy. I don't care as much about the whales and the trees. I do care, but not as much. We all have our issue. We just have to figure out what that issue is. So whether it's slavery or discrimination or poverty or something, everyone has something. You have awesome skills. You have awesome abilities. Be able to apply that to addressing. If you get corporations to do that, wow, we would have a much better world. With that, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I don't know if...
Has some questions that they would like to ask. I have one here in the front.
Yes, please stand up.
Thank you. That was fascinating and inspirational. I was struck in the beginning when you showed that map of red zones,
yes,
that Australia and New Zealand are red zone.
Okay.
And that was rather shocking to me.
We're used to heat maps reflecting red is bad. They were just colors in that particular case. Oh. Yeah, so, no. They have come up with another map that doesn't do that, and my apologies for not replacing that. I get that question a lot, yes.
Any other questions?
I have a question here.
Okay.
Again, thank you. It's a very compelling stories, but I have to ask if, when you talk about the village, how they're duped and the wedding, and even people who are working and fed the lies, deceptions, how is the word not getting out? I'm hearing this for the first time, but I'm not seeing how that is really going to be a supply source. We've all probably read stories about how families actually have sold their own children because they can't afford to feed them. And so where is that supply really coming from? Because those stories don't seem, in a village, it seems like they could do that one time, but not again.
Yeah, that's a very good question. We often hear that a family is so poor that they sell their kids. That doesn't happen very often. Very dysfunctional families, perhaps. Whether you're poor or rich, you still love your kids. You're not going to do everything to protect them. But good question on the duping side. Okay, in Asia, if you get into a situation where somebody takes advantage of you, you don't go home and tell anybody. You lie about the experience because you lose face. Face is such an important part of being in Asian culture. And so you go back, maybe you went to Thailand, you were put on one of these boats, and you were gone for 4 years. When you come back, you're like, woo-woo, had a great opportunity, made all kinds of money, life was good. You don't want people to know that. And so the biggest problem that we have is we go into this community and say, if you go over to Thailand, you can get trafficked. And then they say, well, what are you talking about? Here's 10 people who just came back, and they're all saying it's great. So who are you going to believe? So this issue of not losing face is such an important part of those cultures that's one of the biggest things that we're up against. In the United States, in Europe, and other parts of the world, you come back and you say, I was tricked. Everyone's like, wow, what can we do to help? And then they don't get tricked nearly as easily. So you're right that in certain parts of the world that would work, but not in Asia and Africa and parts of Latin America as well.
Hey, thank you for your talk. You put up a slide with respect to legislation that's currently either in process or complete. You only had one state in the United States out of 50 on that.
Yeah,
you just spoke about face and saving face. How do the rest of the other 49 save face?
Okay, you're talking about the California Transparency Act?
Right. There was nothing else on there about other U.S. acts.
Yeah, see, the interesting thing is that you don't, if you're a big corporation and you have one product in California, it doesn't matter if it's in any of the other state. It applies to all of the other states in the union. Okay, so it's kind of a clever way of being able to have California dictate what happens all over the world. Modern Slavery Act does the same thing. So it simply says if you have a product in California, which major Fortune 500 companies plus would have, and you have revenues over $100 million in retail or manufacturing, you have to list what it is that's on there. Now, there was an attempt in the United States to have a federal version of this. It didn't move forward. I think eventually it will. The problem is that France just had another one come out. Australia's in the process. You'll find many countries are going down the same path. What happens when you have 25 of these different things with all different types of characteristics? What Reuters actually and some other organizations, there's a nice article on this, basically said, let's consolidate. Let's have one act that addresses all of these things so that we don't have to be doing this for UK and California and every other. And I think that's very kind of responsible, appropriate direction for us to be going in.
Hi. I wondered how you saw modern emerging technologies like blockchain playing a part in driving more ethical supply chains globally. You know those little short films that describe how Bitcoin and everything works, and it's supposed to break it down into a bite-sized piece that helps you to understand it? Well, I've watched like 6 of those, and I still don't get it. I do understand and appreciate, though, that this type of technology allows for the tracking of money in a way that we have never seen before. So you're going to see that all of a sudden, if we move in the direction, I think a certain percentage of banks will have maybe 10% or 20% of their business associated with this, then you're going to find it much more difficult to cheat and steal and get away with things that you got away with in the past. So I think it really has the potential to allow for the tracking of the money that is going from place to place. I don't know, you may have heard that Western Union actually got hit for a fine of $560 million. You know, it's a difficult business for them to be in because people move money from one place to the other. How do you track what that money is? But I think we're going to begin to see more and more of that activity over time. And it's not just going to be the banks, it's many other organizations as well. And perhaps this technology will be helpful in addressing some of that. Thanks. I was actually, absolutely, one of the areas I was thinking about as well was specifically, I've read some things around, for example, that the fishing industry and actually having the technology to be able to actually capture a haul and then track it as it moves from the actual fishing boats into factories, into packing, and then eventually ends up on the shelves. So it's much more that sort of application I was referring to more.
Yeah, and we've actually seen, like in Texas, in the Gulf of Mexico, you have ships that the fish, you know, from the boat, the time it was captured to the supermarket, you go to Trader Joe's, you can go in and you can see that whether it's free catch or where it comes from, which country, and so forth. That traceability will get better and it will improve over time. The difficulty in Thailand is you have around 360,000 fishermen that are out there. There's a certain percentage of the boats are here, anywhere from 14 to 18%, that are rogue boats. They're out there, they're illegally fishing. They take their transponder off. They do all this kind of illegal activity. But what happens is the pickup boats will come in and pick up from legitimate boats and from illegitimate boats. And that's where the issue comes in. How do you get this illegitimate catch to, and if you're talking about like meal fish that has really little value, why would you want to go to the trouble to do that type of a thing? So that's why you're seeing, in Thailand, and them really struggling to figure out, well, how do we use traceability to address this issue? Thanks.
Thank you. So we're about out of time. I wanted to ask one question for you, Matt. I just would want to see if you could give us a few words about collective actions and what businesses can do with things like the Mekong Club and other collective actions out there to work together on this.
That's a good question. Well, when we first started in Hong Kong, we could hardly get anyone to talk to us. You know, they didn't know who we were, what we were doing, what our motives were. Gradually started doing a bunch of presentations. Through word of mouth, we got to a point where we eventually did 500 presentations to, 50,000 corporate people. Eventually set up our association, have these working groups. And June 15th of this month, the private sector organizations within Hong Kong have decided they're going to come together and have a declaration that we, the city of Hong Kong, think that modern slavery is a terrible thing, and we're going to basically say that we're against it, and we are going to do what we can to address it. Non-binding, but to think that Hong Kong would go from having no discussion at all to stepping up and doing this, this is where the hero element comes in for me. I mean, I don't know why it is that this issue is my issue. I mean, it just kept coming back to me, and it really bothered me and so forth. But it is. And there's a certain percentage of people in this room, for whatever reason, if given a choice, this would be the issue that you want to address because it really bothers you, whatever. How do we tap into that? How do we get that to be something that's on the forefront? So it's not just always about risk, but about being out in front, being heroic, being out there to really address these types of things. I would love to find the space to allow for corporations to do that, because I know you have a heart for this. I know you guys care. You do. You're not in the job that you're in if you didn't. And so basically, the question of our time is, how do we tap into that? How do we allow for corporations to use a percentage of what they do to do good? Again, not only for this, but anything else. That's the question of our time. And that, when we're talking about corporate social responsibility, sustainability, it's something else. It doesn't fit under that. It's something that goes alongside that. That if we were able to do that, would really make a difference. Thank you.